Ready to jump in the time machine? Buckle up, because
Yeah.
we're going all the way back to 1990.
Wow, 1990.
Yep, 1990. And we're using this incredible IWGIA yearbook as our guide.
Oh, nice.
It's packed with all this information about, well, Indigenous people's rights around the world.
I'm excited to hear this.
It is a dense read, though, not gonna lie.
Oh, yeah.
So we're here to kind of like break it down, pull out some of the most fascinating insights, and, make it a little bit more digestible.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
what I find so fascinating about this particular yearbook is that it captures this world like right on the edge of huge change.
Oh, yeah.
The Berlin Wall's coming down, the Cold War's ending.
Right.
And these massive shifts,
Yeah.
they had like these ripple effects that, I mean, they reached even the most remote indigenous communities.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of like we're looking through this window into this really pivotal moment, and we can see how those big global events and the struggles of indigenous peoples
Right.
are all kind of intertwined.
Yeah, and one of the things that jumps out from this yearbook is how interconnected everything is.
Okay.
You see environmental destruction in one part of the world and how that's actually linked to, the exploitation of indigenous lands in another part.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Political upheaval, it leads to displacement, human rights abuses, and I mean, it really is like this one big complex tapestry.
It is. It is.
All right, so let's start unpacking this tapestry, shall we? The IWGIA yearbook, it doesn't hold back.
Okay.
It talks about some pretty harsh realities.
Mm-hmm.
It even uses the term ecocide
Yeah.
to describe how mining, logging, and development projects, with the backing of governments sometimes, were just encroaching on indigenous territories.
Yeah, and it's not just the economic exploitation. It's the violence, the human rights abuses.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most shocking things I read was about the Tuareg people in Mali and Niger.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine being forced from your home, in Algeria or Libya, only to face, like, massacres and persecution.
Yeah.
Estimates say somewhere between 600 and 1,700 Tuareg were killed in Niger alone.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of that tragedy.
No.
And what's even more disturbing is that the organization behind this U-book, IWGIA, they had to step in, like, document and protest these atrocities.
Yeah, which points to this bigger issue that the yearbook highlights.
Yeah.
This lack of accountability, this lack of justice.
Right.
They were ignored, their voices silenced.
And it wasn't just an isolated incident either. There's this other chilling parallel in Mauritania. The government there had this policy, they called it Arabization,
Okay.
aimed at like promoting Arabic language and culture,
Mm-hmm.
but it led to displacement and human rights violations of Black Mauritanians.
Yeah, it's tragic how cultural differences can be used to justify those kinds of things.
Yeah, and the impact was huge. It
Yeah.
spilled over borders, created a very tense situation with Senegal. From the Sahel, we go to the Horn of Africa, where there's another story unfolding.
Right.
Eritrea is fighting for independence from Ethiopia, a long and bloody fight. And the capture of Massawa, that port city, that was a turning point.
It was a turning point, but a victory with a huge cost.
Right.
Hostages, executions, so much bitterness.
And then you add in the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF.
Right.
They're this powerful force, and their stance on Eritrean democracy, it kept shifting, which just added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation.
Oh, I could see that.
And in the middle of all this, the yearbook sheds light on the Ogaden refugees who ended up in Somalia.
Oh, yeah.
They were caught, in this political web, facing forced repatriation, and then this controversy over their ethnic status.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's really hard to read about. There are even reports of men being forced into the Ethiopian army when they were sent back.
Oh, wow.
These stories from Africa, they just show how everything's connected. Political turmoil, ethnic tensions, just fighting for basic rights is all tangled together.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's hop across the Atlantic to the Americas.
All right.
Remember that feeling of optimism after the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Yeah.
Well, in Canada, that kind of clashed with Indigenous rights in this shocking confrontation between the Mohawk people and the Canadian military.
Whoa, what happened?
Well, it started with this plan to expand a golf course,
Okay.
and this expansion would have threatened a Mohawk burial ground in Oka, Quebec.
Oh, no.
And it just escalated like crazy.
Oh, really?
Barricades, a police officer was killed, and there was this tense siege that went on for weeks.
Wow.
This whole thing, the Oka crisis, it was a real wake-up call for Canada.
Yeah, I bet.
It exposed, this troubled history with Indigenous rights, the issue of Mohawk sovereignty.
It's kind of amazing that something like a golf course
Yeah.
could spark such a major event.
Yeah, and the Oka crisis, that wasn't the only thing happening. The yearbook talks about Indigenous people all across Canada taking action that same year.
Oh, wow.
From the Blood Tribe and the Blackfoot Nation in the west to the Nuu-chah-nulth and Ojibwa communities in the east.
Oh, it was a nationwide movement.
Yeah, there were protests, blockades, legal battles, all aimed at protecting their lands and asserting their rights. There's even this one group, the Lone Fighters Society in Alberta. They literally dug up a dam
Wow.
to protect pagan land rights.
Wow, that's taking direct action.
Yeah, pretty powerful symbol of resistance, right?
Yeah.
And internationally, even the UN condemned Canada for how they were treating the Lubicon Lake Band. They were being deprived of their land and their resources.
That's pretty significant.
While all this was happening in Canada, just south, in the U.S., the Puyallup tribe achieved a pretty big but also kind of bittersweet victory. After years of being dispossessed, they received this $162 million settlement.
Wow, 162 million.
Yeah, it's a lot of money, but it's also, a stark reminder of the economic hardship and exploitation they had faced. The yearbook even talks about car salesmen and drug dealers, like, waiting outside when tribal members got their checks. It's just this, it shows the vulnerability and desperation even in this moment of supposed victory.
Right.
But of course, the fight for justice doesn't end there. The yearbook goes on to talk about the Supreme Court and their ruling on peyote use in religious ceremonies, violence against Chippewa spearfishers, and the debate over gambling on tribal lands.
It seems like one thing after another.
It is. It's like this constant struggle.
Yeah.
Then further south, in Mexico, Indigenous people were facing similar challenges. Hunger strikes over land rights, a government that was very slow to recognize their languages and culture.
Okay.
And then you add in Guatemalan refugees fleeing conflict, and you see how interconnected everything is, right? Indigenous communities across borders, facing shared challenges, supporting each other.
Yeah, I see that.
So from Mexico, the yearbook gives us this whirlwind tour of Central and South America. Environmental destruction in El Salvador and Nicaragua, discrimination and terrible healthcare in Venezuela, violence against indigenous leaders in Colombia. The list just goes on and on.
It's almost overwhelming.
It is. And at the heart of it are these fundamental problems, right? Exploitation of resources, disregard for indigenous rights, this failure to address the root causes of poverty and inequality.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is. One of the most tragic stories is about the Yanomami in Brazil.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine your ancestral lands, the rainforest, just overrun by gold miners. Disease, violence, environmental devastation.
That's awful.
It is, and it's a perfect example of how economic interests were put above the well-being of these communities and the environment.
Yeah, I see that.
All right, so welcome back to our journey through 1990.
Back to 1990.
Using the IWGIA yearbook.
Right.
In that first part, we really dug into the challenges, those harsh realities that Indigenous peoples were facing.
It was heavy.
It was. But this yearbook, it's not all doom and gloom.
Okay.
It's also this testament to their resilience, their resourcefulness. You see them actively working to protect their rights, their lands, their cultures.
It's pretty amazing.
It is. And they did it on so many different fronts.
I can imagine.
It's inspiring how they didn't just accept these injustices.
Right.
They took action, organized, made their voices heard.
So many different ways, right?
So many different ways. We saw some glimpses of that in part one.
Yeah, like the Lone Fighters in Alberta.
The Lone Fighters,
Yeah.
the Mohawk standoff in Okamika.
Right.
But this yearbook, it shows this whole spectrum of resistance.
Okay.
Legal battles, international campaigns, even efforts to revitalize their languages and traditions.
Oh, it's so important.
It is. It's like they were fighting this multi-pronged battle for survival.
Battle for survival.
Yeah, and one of the key things that jumps out from this yearbook is how important collaboration and solidarity were.
Right.
You see Indigenous peoples coming together, sharing strategy, supporting each other, amplifying their voices on this global stage.
It's powerful stuff.
It is. It's fascinating to see how interconnected these movements were, even back then. The yearbook talks about all these regional and interregional conferences, seminars, gatherings. Indigenous leaders from different parts of the world connecting, learning from each other.
That must have been incredible.
Yeah, think about the power of that, right?
Yeah.
Indigenous peoples, they'd been isolated, marginalized for so long, and now they're building these alliances
Right.
across ethnic and geographic boundaries, realizing that they're stronger together.
Strength in numbers.
Exactly, strength in numbers. And this wasn't just, a grassroots movement.
Okay.
Organizations like IWGIA.
Yeah.
They played this huge role in supporting these efforts. They provided platforms for Indigenous leaders to speak at these international forums, documented human rights abuses, advocated for policy changes.
That's crucial, that outside support.
It is, and the yearbook really highlights that, the role of allies in amplifying their voices, bringing their concerns to the world's attention. One example that really stuck with me was the Iquitos Declaration.
Iquitos Declaration, okay.
This document came out of a gathering of Amazonian Indians, environmental organizations, support groups.
Sounds like a powerful mix.
It was this powerful statement of cooperation and solidarity.
What did it focus on?
Well, it recognized this connection between indigenous rights and environmental protection. The idea that protecting the Amazon rainforest wasn't just about saving trees.
Right.
It was about respecting the rights and livelihoods of the indigenous people who called it home.
Makes sense.
And that way of thinking, it wasn't limited to the Amazon.
Oh, okay.
The yearbook mentions similar movements all over the world.
Right.
The World Rainforest Movement in Asia, the Pastoral and Environmental Network in Africa, and even in the Arctic, Indigenous people were inviting politicians, environmentalists, support groups.
Oh, wow.
To talk about how global environmental policies were directly impacting them.
Interesting.
Yeah, pretty forward-thinking.
Yeah.
They were already grappling with globalization, climate change, understanding that decisions made far away could have devastating consequences back home.
That shows real foresight.
It does. And, while governments and corporations, they were often the source of a lot of these problems, the yearbook also points to this growing awareness within those institutions that things needed to change.
Okay, like what?
Well, the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations, for example, it was becoming this platform for Indigenous voices to be heard internationally. And it wasn't just talk. They were starting to develop international standards and mechanisms to protect Indigenous rights.
That's progress, right?
It was slow progress, but progress nonetheless.
Yeah.
The yearbook also puts a spotlight on the role of Indigenous women in these movements. It talks about the Second International Indigenous Women's Conference. They were focused on the world environmental crisis, sustainable development, from the perspective of Indigenous women.
Powerful.
It is powerful, and it's important to remember that these weren't just abstract debates. These were issues directly impacting the lives of women, children, families.
Right.
And their voices, they were often the most powerful in advocating for change.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, that first part of our deep dive, it painted this pretty bleak picture, right?
It did.
But the second part, it's showing us something more hopeful.
Yeah, it is.
There are these powerful forces against them, but there is also this growing movement pushing back, demanding recognition, fighting for a better future.
It's inspiring.
It is. And that fight, it wasn't just on the streets or in courtrooms. It was happening in classrooms, community centers, homes,
Right.
as Indigenous peoples worked to revitalize their languages, their traditions, their cultural practices.
That's so essential.
It is. The yearbook talks about Indigenous schools, cultural centers, media outlets being established, all aimed at reclaiming their history, their identity, their right to self-determination.
Reclaiming what was taken.
Exactly. It was about healing from the past, strengthening their communities, making sure future generations could be proud of their heritage. There's this really interesting example in the yearbook. The first National Congress of Indigenous Peoples in the Soviet Union, held in Moscow in March 1990.
Wow, in Moscow.
Yeah, imagine that. Indigenous leaders from across this vast empire coming together for the first time to talk about their challenges and their aspirations.
That must have been historic.
It was, and out of that came the first National Association of Indigenous Peoples of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
It was a sign of the times. The old order was crumbling, and Indigenous peoples were taking the opportunity to demand a place at the table to have a say in their own future.
Powerful imagery.
It is. And, we've been talking about raising awareness, sharing information, and that brings us to the media. This IWGIA yearbook itself, it was a form of media, right?
Absolutely.
It was this tool for documenting human rights abuses, sharing information with communities and allies, advocating for change.
Powerful tool.
Yeah, and it wasn't alone. The report mentions newsletters, radio programs, community newspapers popping up.
Wow.
These were vital for connecting communities, sharing stories, mobilizing support.
I can see that.
And it wasn't just Indigenous people producing this media.
Okay.
The yearbook talks about journalists, filmmakers, academics amplifying these voices, bringing these issues to a wider audience.
That outside support again?
Yeah, the importance of allyship, of collaboration.
Yeah.
We're starting, I see this more nuanced picture from this deep dive.
Yeah, we are.
Indigenous peoples facing huge challenges, but also actively organizing, resisting, building alliances to fight back. But the question is, what were the outcomes?
Right. What was the impact?
What impact did all these efforts have?
Good question.
It's a tough one, and the yearbook doesn't really give us a complete answer.
Right.
In many ways, these struggles, they were just beginning in 1990. This report, it's like a snapshot, a world in flux, Indigenous peoples at the forefront, demanding change.
A snapshot in time.
Exactly, a snapshot in time, like the early chapters of a much longer story.
And to understand where that story goes,
Right.
we need to look beyond the yearbook to see how those struggles from 1990 connect to the fight for Indigenous rights today.
Exactly. So join us for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll reflect on the legacy of these movements and explore the challenges and opportunities facing Indigenous communities today. All right, so welcome back to the deep dive.
We're back.
We've been on this journey through the IWGIA yearbook from 1990.
1990.
We've seen these immense challenges, this incredible resilience of Indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
But as we come to the end of our exploration, I think it's time to step back and ask,
Okay.
what's the lasting impact? How do those struggles back then connect to the world we live in today?
It is the big question, right? It's
Yeah.
not just a history lesson. It's like this lens
Yeah.
to understand how those Indigenous rights movements have evolved over the past few decades.
So looking back from where we are now in 2024, what do you see as the biggest legacy of those struggles that we read about in this yearbook?
I think it's the rise of this truly global Indigenous movement. The yearbook, it captures those early stages, alliances being formed across continents, shared strategies, that growing presence on the international stage.
It's like all these individual acts of courage, these sparks of resistance.
Right.
They were coming together to create this force for change.
Exactly. And that force, it's only grown stronger since then.
Oh, for sure.
Think about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples,
Oh, yeah.
adopted in 2007. That was huge.
It was a landmark achievement.
A testament to the work of so many.
And it's interesting because the yearbook, it barely even mentions those kinds of international legal frameworks.
Sure.
Back then, it was more about documenting those abuses, raising awareness, building solidarity.
It was about exposing the injustices,
Yeah.
putting pressure on those in power,
Yeah.
creating a sense of shared purpose.
Yeah.
And those early efforts, I think, they laid the groundwork for those later legal victories.
Right. And it wasn't just about laws either.
No.
The yearbook emphasizes cultural revitalization, language preservation, the connection to land.
Those things are still so relevant today.
Absolutely. They're the heart and soul of Indigenous identity. And you see it everywhere now. The resurgence of language programs, the reclaiming of a traditional knowledge, the fight against cultural appropriation, this whole movement for land back.
It's powerful.
It is. It's like they're reclaiming their stories, their heritage, their very essence.
Absolutely. It's about healing, about building strong communities, shaping a future where those cultures can not just survive, but thrive.
So there's progress. We see that.
Yeah.
But let's be real. Indigenous communities, they still face these huge challenges. Land grabs, environmental destruction, systemic discrimination, violence. These things haven't gone away.
And in some ways, those challenges are even more complex now, more interconnected.
Yeah.
Climate change, that's a huge one.
Oh, yeah.
It's an existential threat for so many, even though they contributed the least to causing it.
It's true. And you have globalization, resource extraction, political instability.
Right.
Those things haven't disappeared either.
Right.
If anything, they've intensified, putting even more pressure on Indigenous lands, cultures, livelihoods.
Which is why those lessons from 1990, they matter even more now. That need for solidarity, the power of those strategic alliances, holding those in power accountable, those are the tools that Indigenous movements still use in their fight for justice.
So if there's one big takeaway for our listeners from this deep dive into the IWGIA yearbook, what would you say it is?
I'd say it's that this fight for Indigenous rights, it's a marathon, not a sprint. There have been wins, there have been setbacks, the struggle continues.
And it's a struggle that benefits us all. Their fight for justice, for environmental protection, for cultural diversity, it makes the world a better place.
Yeah. It makes the world richer, more beautiful, well-being of Indigenous peoples. It's connected to the well-being of our planet.
It's all connected.
Their voices, they're essential in shaping a more just and sustainable future.
So we started this journey by going back in time, but we've ended up right here in the present
Wait here.
with, I hope, a better understanding of the past and a renewed sense of purpose for the future.
I hope so too. I hope our listeners feel empowered to keep learning about these issues, to
Yeah.
get involved, to support those communities in their ongoing struggles.
Because their stories are our stories.
Yeah.
And their fight for a just and sustainable world, it's a fight we should all be part of. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.